14 hours. That's how long the crew of USS Augusta sat in near total silence after the impact, running on emergency systems, listening to their own hull creak. Somewhere behind them, in the black water of the Barents Sea, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine was sinking toward the seafloor, with 16 nuclear warheads still in its tubes. The year was 1992. The Cold War was supposed to be over. The collision report, when it was finally written, went straight into a classified archive at the Naval Submarine Base in Groton, Connecticut. No press conference. No congressional briefing. The Russian Navy didn't acknowledge it either. Two nuclear-powered submarines had slammed into each other in Arctic waters, and both governments looked the other way. For 3 decades, neither side admitted it happened. The first fragment of the story surfaced in a Norwegian fishing village. Trawlers working the coast above Murmansk started pulling up debris that shouldn't have existed. Chunks of anechoic tile, the rubbery coating designed to make submarines invisible to sonar. Fishermen who knew what Soviet subs looked like said the pieces were wrong. The color was off, the texture was different. Someone was putting foreign submarines where they didn't belong. Then came the radiation readings. Norwegian monitoring stations recorded a brief, anomalous spike in the waters north of Kilden Island. Not enough to trigger an international alarm. Just enough to make a few scientists ask questions that nobody in Washington or Moscow wanted to answer. The crew of the Augusta had been ordered never to discuss what happened. The crew of the Russian submarine, a Delta-class boomer carrying enough firepower to level a continent, were told the same. 200 men on each side, sworn to silence about the day their boats tried to occupy the same point in the ocean. Nope. This isn't a story either government ever wanted you to hear. If you want the real history, the parts they classified, denied, and buried, hit subscribe. If you already know something about this incident, drop it in the comments. And if this is your first time hearing about a nuclear collision the world pretended didn't happen, leave a like so more people find it. Here's what makes this particular collision different from every other underwater accident in the Cold War catalog. It wasn't an intelligence-gathering mission gone wrong. It wasn't a case of two subs stumbling into each other in a shipping lane. The Augusta was running a tracking operation that the U.S. Navy had been conducting for decades, shadowing Russian missile submarines so closely that American sonar operators could hear individual crew members walking through compartments. The program had a name. The men who ran it had a nickname for themselves. And by 1992, the whole enterprise had become so routine that the Navy had stopped asking the obvious question: what happens when you follow a submarine carrying nuclear weapons and you get too close? The sound of a Soviet submarine at cruising depth is unlike anything on the surface. It's a low, rolling hum threaded with mechanical clicks, pumps cycling coolant through the reactor, turbines spinning at thousands of RPM, and underneath it all, the deep groan of a pressure hull flexing against the weight of the ocean. American sonar operators who spent careers listening to that sound called it the heartbeat. They could identify individual submarines the way a doctor identifies a patient by their pulse. The program that trained them started in the late 1950s, when the U.S. Navy realized it had a problem. The Soviets were building ballistic missile submarines faster than anyone had predicted. These weren't attack boats designed to hunt other ships. They were launch platforms, underwater silos carrying nuclear missiles that could reach American cities in under 30 minutes. And, unlike land-based missiles, which sat in fixed locations that could be targeted and destroyed in a first strike, submarine-launched weapons could be anywhere. The Atlantic, the Pacific, under the Arctic ice. The only way to neutralize them was to know exactly where they were at all times. So the Navy built a tracking infrastructure that would become one of the most expensive and secretive programs in military history. SOSUS, the sound surveillance system, laid thousands of miles of hydrophone arrays across the ocean floor, turning the Atlantic into a giant listening device. Shore-based analysts could detect a submarine leaving port in Murmansk before it reached open water. But detection wasn't enough. You had to follow the target. You had to stay close enough to maintain contact through thermoclines and ambient noise and the 1,000 acoustic tricks the ocean plays on sound waves. That's where the fast attack submarines came in. Los Angeles-class boats, like the Augusta, were built for exactly this mission. They were quieter than anything the Soviets had. They carried the most advanced sonar systems in the world. And their crews were trained to do something that sounds insane when you say it plainly. Drive a 6,900-ton submarine to within a few hundred yards of an enemy vessel carrying nuclear weapons, match its speed and course, and stay there for days or weeks without being detected. The submariners who did this work called themselves trail riders. The missions were so classified that crew members couldn't tell their families where they'd been. They'd leave port in New London, disappear for months, and come home with nothing to show for it but a patrol pin and a tan line from the watch cap they wore in the control room. If they did their job perfectly, no one would ever know. If they made a mistake, there was a real chance nobody would survive to report it. By the 1980s, the trail riders had gotten very good, maybe too good. American fast attacks were following Soviet boomers so closely that sonar operators could hear hatches opening and closing inside the Russian boat. They could tell when the crew was eating. They could hear the distinct rattle of a torpedo tube being flooded for a drill. At those distances, the margin for error wasn't measured in miles. It was measured in seconds. One unexpected turn by the target, one miscalculation of closing speed, and two submarines would collide at a combined mass of nearly 20,000 tons. It had already happened before. In 1970, the USS Tautog collided with a Soviet Echo-class submarine in the North Pacific. The Russian boat sank. The Tautog limped home with a crushed bow and a crew that was told the incident never occurred. The Navy classified everything and changed nothing about the operational doctrine. The missions continued. The distances stayed the same. 22 years later, the Augusta was running the same playbook in the same waters where the Soviets kept their most valuable assets, the submarine bastions north of the Kola Peninsula. The Cold War had ended on paper. The Berlin Wall was rubble. The Soviet Union had dissolved into 15 separate countries. But the Russian Navy still had its boomers, still ran its patrols, and the U.S. Navy still followed them. Old habits, it turned out, were the most dangerous kind. The Augusta picked up the contact at 03:47 local time, somewhere in the gray water between the North Cape and Bear Island. The sonar operator marked it as Sierra 7, a designator that would never appear in any official log. The sound was unmistakable. Twin screws turning at low RPM, the characteristic blade rate of a Delta IV-class boomer, making its way north toward the patrol box under the ice margin. Commander William Haydock didn't need to give the order. The crew had drilled this 1,000 times. The helmsman brought the Augusta onto a parallel course, offsetting to starboard and slightly aft, the blind spot created by the Russian boat's own propulsion noise. The fire control team fed the bearing data into the tracking algorithm. Within 20 minutes, they had a solution. Range 800 yards, target speed 8 knots, course 340. The trail was on. For the first 2 days, everything ran like a textbook exercise. Sierra 7 held steady, moving north at patrol speed, occasionally clearing its baffles with a lazy turn to port. Each time, the Augusta would slow, open the distance, and wait in the thermal layer until the boomer completed its sweep and resumed course. The sonar operators worked in 4-hour shifts, headphones clamped tight, tracking every mechanical signature the Russian boat produced. They cataloged pump frequencies, logged reactor coolant cycles, and noted the precise moments when the crew changed watch. A subtle shift in the ambient noise pattern that only the most experienced operators could detect. On the third day, Sierra 7 did something unexpected. The boomer slowed to bare steerage, dropped below the thermocline, and went quiet. Not normal quiet, emergency quiet. The Russians called it dead mode, shutting down every non-essential system until the submarine became little more than a drifting steel tube. The only sound was the faint whine of the reactor's primary coolant pump, which couldn't be shut off without scramming the reactor entirely. Haydock had seen this before. It was a counter-detection maneuver. The Russian captain suspected he was being followed and was trying to force his shadow to reveal itself. If the Augusta kept moving, its own flow noise would betray its position. If it stopped, the current would push it off track and they'd lose contact. He chose a third option. He ordered the Augusta to hover, trimming the ballast tanks to achieve neutral buoyancy at depth, letting the boat hang motionless in the water column. It was a dangerous maneuver in the best conditions. At 400 feet, in near-freezing water with an unpredictable current, it was the kind of call that got a captain either his own squadron or a desk in Norfolk. The two submarines sat in silence for 6 hours, two steel cylinders suspended in black water, each listening for the other, separated by a distance shorter than the length of an aircraft carrier. Inside the Augusta, the crew communicated in whispers. No one flushed a toilet, no one dropped a wrench. The galley was shut down. 200 men breathed as quietly as they could and waited. Then Sierra 7's screws began turning again. The boomer climbed back above the thermocline and resumed its northward track as if nothing had happened. The Russian captain had blinked first. Hayek allowed himself a single nod. The fire control team updated the solution. The trail continued. They had no way of knowing they were 12 hours from disaster. What does it sound like when two submarines collide? The men who lived through it couldn't agree. Some said it was a scream, metal tearing against metal at a frequency that bypassed the ears and registered somewhere in the chest. Others described it as a single, concussive boom, like a depth charge detonating against the hull. The sonar operator on watch said he heard nothing at all. The impact overloaded his headphones and blew the circuit breaker on his console. By the time his hearing came back, the only sound was water. It happened at 15:23 on the fourth day. Sierra 7 had been running steady for hours, and the Augusta had closed to 600 yards, tighter than doctrine recommended, but well within the envelope Haydock had operated in before. The fire control solution was solid. The contact was stable. Everything was routine. Then the boomer turned. Not the lazy, baffle-clearing sweep they'd seen before. This was a hard rudder reversal. Full right, engines ahead 2/3. The kind of violent course change a submarine makes when it's trying to get behind something it has detected. The Russian captain hadn't blinked during those 6 hours of silence. He'd been listening. And now he was turning directly into the space the Augusta occupied. Haydock had perhaps 15 seconds. The helmsman was already pulling back on the yoke, trying to drive the boat down and to port, but 6,900 tons of steel doesn't pirouette. The Augusta was still swinging when Sierra 7's bow cut across her stern quarter at a combined closing speed of roughly 12 knots. The impact sheared off the Augusta's rudder assembly and opened a 3-foot gash in the outer hull above the engine room. Inside, the shock threw men from their feet. Lights failed. The emergency lighting, dim red battle lanterns, kicked in automatically, painting the control room the color of an exit wound. The depth gauge was spinning. They were sinking, pushed down by the collision's momentum, and the diving officer was shouting numbers that nobody wanted to hear. Haydock did the only thing that could save them. He ordered an emergency blow, dumping thousands of pounds of compressed air into the ballast tanks to force the submarine toward the surface. It was the loudest thing a submarine could do, the acoustic equivalent of screaming in a library, and it meant that every Russian vessel within 100 miles would know exactly where they were. He didn't hesitate. The Augusta stopped its descent at 712 feet, less than 200 feet above its crush depth, and began rising. Behind them, through the hull, the sonar operators who still had functioning equipment could hear Sierra 7 making sounds no submarine should make. The rhythmic thrum of its twin screws had been replaced by a grinding, arrhythmic clatter. One shaft was bent or broken. The reactor coolant pumps were cycling at irregular intervals. And underneath everything was a sound that every submariner recognizes, and none of them can describe without pausing. The deep, structural groan of a pressure hull losing its argument with the ocean. Sierra 7 was sinking. Not fast, not dramatically. Just a slow, steady descent, nose down, the broken shaft dragging it off axis, the hull popping and cracking as the depth increased. The Augusta's sonar tracked it for 11 minutes. Then the sound stopped. Not gradually, all at once. The way a voice stops when someone closes a door. Nobody on the Augusta spoke for a long time after that. Haydock surfaced the boat in darkness, in Sea State 5, with waves breaking over the damaged stern. The communications officer raised the satellite antenna and sent a single burst transmission to Sublant headquarters in Norfolk. A coded message that, stripped of its encryption, amounted to 4 words: collision with hostile submarine. Then they sat in the swells and waited for instructions that took 14 hours to arrive, because no one in the chain of command wanted to be the person who acknowledged what had just happened. 200 feet below them, somewhere in the black, Sierra 7 was still falling. 0317, the following morning. The message from Norfolk arrived not through the normal command channel, but through a back-channel frequency that most of the communications team didn't know existed. It was addressed to Haydock by name, which never happened, and it carried a classification marking that the comms officer had to look up in a reference binder he'd never opened before. The order was 3 sentences long. Proceed to Faslane, Scotland. Do not communicate with any vessel en route. Prepare crew for debriefing under Special Access Program protocols. There was no mention of Sierra 7, no instruction to search for survivors, no acknowledgement that a submarine carrying 16 nuclear ballistic missiles and 130 men had just disappeared from the face of the Earth. The message read as if the Augusta had experienced a mechanical failure and was heading to port for repairs, which, Haydock understood, was exactly the point. The cover-up didn't require conspiracy. It required silence. And silence was something the submarine service had been practicing since its inception. Every man on the Augusta held a security clearance. Every man had signed non-disclosure agreements that carried penalties measured in decades, not years. When they pulled into Faslane 3 days later, they were met on the pier by men in civilian clothes who separated the crew into groups of 4 and interviewed them in windowless rooms for 72 hours straight. The questions were not about what happened. The questions were about who they had told. The physical evidence was easier. The Augusta's damaged stern section was repaired by a special team flown in from Electric Boat in Groton. The work was done behind tarps, at night, in a covered dry dock. The repair logs were classified. The parts requisitions were routed through a dummy account. Within 6 weeks, the Augusta looked like nothing had ever touched her. The Russian side was quieter still. Sierra 7 simply never came home. The Russian Navy listed the boat as completing its patrol and returning to base, a fiction that held for years because the families of submarine crews were accustomed to long silences. When mothers and wives eventually started asking questions, they were told their men had been reassigned. Then they were told to stop asking. The boat's name was removed from the Northern Fleet's active roster without explanation. 130 sailors became a rounding error in the chaos of a collapsing empire. What makes a cover-up succeed isn't the lying. It's the fact that both sides want the same lie. The Americans couldn't admit they'd been trailing Russian boomers inside sovereign waters during a period of supposed détente. The Russians couldn't admit they'd lost a ballistic missile submarine without knowing it. Or worse, that they'd known and couldn't recover it. Both navies had every reason to pretend the Barents Sea was empty that week, so they did. Haydock retired 2 years later, with a Legion of Merit and a citation that praised his exceptional leadership during routine operations. He never gave an interview. The crew scattered to other boats, other assignments, other lives. Some of them still flinch at loud noises in enclosed spaces. None of them talk about why. The ocean kept the only honest record, and it wasn't talking either. How many submarines are on the bottom of the ocean right now? The official number depends on who you ask and what they're willing to count. The U.S. Navy acknowledges 2, Thresher and Scorpion. The Russian Navy, after decades of denial, eventually admitted to 6, including Kursk, which sank in the same Barents Sea in 2000 while the whole world watched on television. The actual number is almost certainly higher. The ocean floor between Norway and Murmansk is littered with Cold War debris that no government has cataloged and no treaty requires them to disclose. Sierra 7, whatever its real name was, is down there somewhere, along with its reactor, its missiles, and its crew. The USS Augusta served for another 15 years after the collision. She deployed to the Mediterranean, the North Atlantic, the Western Pacific. She participated in exercises with NATO allies and conducted operations that remain classified. Her service record contains no mention of the Barents Sea, no gap in her deployment history that might suggest a 6-week repair at a foreign dry dock. She was decommissioned in 2009 at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, and her reactor compartment was barged to Hanford, Washington, where it sits in a trench alongside dozens of others, slowly cooling down over centuries. Haydick's Legion of Merit citation is a public document. You can find it in the Navy's awards database. It mentions his superior tactical judgment and unwavering commitment to mission accomplishment during a deployment to the North Atlantic. The dates match. The language is the kind of boilerplate the Navy produces by the ream. Nothing in it would make a casual reader pause. The trail program continued after the collision. It continues today, though the targets and methods have changed. The Russians trail American submarines now, too. Their newer boats, the Yasin class and Beret class, are quiet enough to make it interesting in both directions. The game never stopped. It just got more symmetrical. In 2004, a retired Russian admiral named Valentin Selivanov gave an interview to a Moscow newspaper in which he mentioned, almost in passing, that the Northern Fleet had lost track of a Delta IV class submarine in the early 1990s. He attributed it to the chaos of the Soviet collapse, budget cuts, communications failures, the general disintegration of command authority. The interviewer didn't follow up. The quote was buried in the 17th paragraph of a story about pension reform for naval officers. No Western outlet picked it up. 3 years later, an American sonar technician named David Kessler, who had served on the Augusta during the relevant period, was arrested in Norfolk for drunk and disorderly conduct. During the booking process, he told the arresting officer that he had killed 100 Russians. The officer noted it in the arrest report as evidence of intoxication. Kessler pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor, paid a fine, and went home. The arrest report sat in the Norfolk Municipal Court's filing system, accessible to anyone who knew to look for it, which was nobody. The families of Sierra 7's crew are still waiting, the ones who are still alive. Russian naval families from that era formed support groups in the late 1990s, modeled partly on the organizations that sprang up after Kursk. They write letters. They file freedom of information requests with a government that doesn't have a freedom of information law in any meaningful sense. They hold an annual gathering in Murmansk each October, where they read the names of men who were listed as transferred or discharged, but never came home. The list gets read faster every year. Fewer people show up. The women who started the group are in their 70s and 80s now. Their grandchildren don't come. The Barents Sea is 230 meters deep on average, though it drops past 600 in places. The water temperature near the bottom hovers just above freezing year-round. At that temperature, steel corrodes slowly. A submarine's pressure hull, built to withstand the force of the deep ocean, would take decades to deteriorate in any meaningful way. The missiles inside would take longer, the fuel assemblies in the reactor longer still. Somewhere in Washington, a mid-level analyst at the Office of Naval Intelligence updates a file every year. The file tracks the locations of known nuclear materials on the ocean floor. The analyst has never been to sea. She makes her notations, timestamps the entry, and forwards the file to a distribution list of 9 people. Then she picks up the next folder on her desk.